The attitude of the 19th century non-subscribers to what we would nowadays call world religions has been somewhat misrepresented and also misunderstood in the past by some historians. And a major reason for that really centres on a remark attributed to someone who is identified in the writings of the time of the 1860s as an Antrim elder, a notorious elder from the Presbytery of Antrim, who apparently expressed very radical opinion about wanting to develop a church that could include pantheists, people who believe that God is found in nature, could embrace Muslims, could embrace Hindus, could be very wide-reaching. And it was even attributed to this elder that he had commented that even if a minister became an atheist, that shouldn't preclude him from being a minister. And this was something that caused absolute scandal at the time. Now, the elder concerned was a very interesting man called Robert McCalmont. McCalmont came from Larne, and he was the son of a widow. And he ended up in Belfast, somewhere in the York Street region, and very quickly, by the time he was in his early 30s, had become a very senior and influential member of the York Street congregation. And he seems to have come to the attention of the Ritchie family. And among the Ritchies were industrialists, business people in the Mount Pottinger area. And McCalmont appears to have been a commercial traveller at first, and he seems to have gone to work for the Ritchies, probably in that capacity. But his talents were spotted, and he was sent to study chemistry. He became a noted chemist. He developed a business of his own, and at one time he even ran as a parliamentary candidate for Westminster. Very remarkable man with some very remarkable ideas. And he did make a comment of the sort that was attributed to him. But we should think about this, first of all, in the context of the conversation itself, and then secondly, in the broader context of the attitude of the non-subscribers of the time. First of all, this comment was made, as far as we can tell, in a speculative conversation, a conversation in which he and a man called Scott of Girvan, at that time there were very close relationships between some of the Ulster non-subscribers and a Unitarian congregation in Girvan. And McCalmont had travelled over to Scotland and was talking to Scott. And this conversation that he had with the Scottish gentleman got misrepresented. Actually, McAllister of Hollywood came to hear of it and was incensed. Montgomery himself got to hear of it, and arguments raged about it for a long time. But it does appear that Scott and McCalmont were simply speculating about their ideas. McCalmont, incidentally, was a leading figure in the Sunday school. He persuaded the Ritchies to offer a room in their factory in Mount Pottinger, which was where a Sunday school was started, and those were the roots of the Mount Pottinger Church. And McCalmont was also very involved in the Free Congregational Union, so very remarkable, intelligent, free-spirited and free-thinking man. But to look at this more broadly in the context of what the non-subscribers were thinking of at the time, we should perhaps first note a remark made by Montgomery himself toward the end of the 1850s. And at this time, Montgomery and McGuinness of York Street were having, among their disputes, a discourse about the role and nature of the clerkship in the Remonstrant Synod. And Montgomery became so irritated at that time with McGuinness that he said he wouldn't care if a Muslim became clerk, because the clerk was a secretary whose responsibility was simply to write down the words that other people said and not to add or to take away from those words. And so we see here Montgomery's attitude is being open to the idea that a Muslim would be welcome within the broad confines of non-subscription. So perhaps that dilutes a little the sensation that was associated with McCalmont's remarks. Also, the non-subscribers at this time had a literary society in which they were discussing ideas of Hinduism and also Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion that's followed, among others, by the Farsi people of India. And we should look more closely at the non-subscribers' attitude to Hinduism at this time, because this was something which was to cause such scandal among the Orthodox Presbyterians of the time that the non-subscribers actually became accused of following Brahma and worshipping 3 million gods. And I think that the root of this was an association, particularly between John Scott Porter of First Church and a man called Rammohun Roy. Rammohun Roy was an Indian Raja who was brought up as a Hindu, but his early education was among Muslims, and so he became exposed to monotheism. And he travelled to England and he became interested in Unitarianism, and John Scott Porter understood him to be a Unitarian and saw him as a Unitarian theologian, and certainly Rammohun Roy thought very carefully about Unitarianism. But Rammohun Roy was primarily an Indian social and religious reformer. And among other things, he wanted to see a form of Hinduism, a Brahmanistic form of Hinduism that was monotheistic. So that's something to think about, monotheistic Hinduism. And those were the ideas of Rammohun Roy, and that's what brought him into such close contact with theological ideas of Unitarianism at the time. And we should remember that when in the 1880s, in 1883, there was what's sometimes described as the Hindu service in Second Congregation, which was still on Rosemary Street at that time. It was actually the Brahmo Somaj that was being used at that time. And the Brahmo Somaj form of Hinduism originates in the thinking of Rammohun Roy. And so we can see again this complex web of ideas that are completely intertwined, and the Liberals are taking them in one direction and the Conservatives may be taking them in another, but in the core there are shared ideas that are simply being developed in different ways. And so that tells us something about the attitude of the 19th century non-subscribers to world religions. And they also had quite an interesting attitude to biblical translation, and we'll look at that next time.